Well, what do we make of this? What do we make of the fact that a nation of slave owners declared their independence on the principle that all men are created equal? I've given you some handouts you're free to take with you, a few excerpts to help us guide our conversation here today. Take a look on page 3. Up at the top, I've given you the first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. I assume these words are very familiar to you. That ringing line in the beginning of the second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Virtually every scholar, every pundit, every commentator who looks at this, writes about this, talks about this, assumes, well, the founders, and Jefferson in particular, who is the main author of this document, he certainly didn't mean to include blacks. And definitely he did not mean to include African slaves. Well, when we actually look at the evidence, do you remember how Jefferson came to write the Declaration? Sort of a funny story. This is a little more than a year into the shooting war with the British. The battles of Lexington and Concord had happened already, back in April of '75. For the first 8 or 9 months, Washington and his officers in the Continental Army, what they wanted was a redress of their grievances. They wanted representation in Parliament. And they couldn't get that. And so finally Washington agrees that independence is the only thing that will secure justice for the American cause. So the Continental Congress then decides they want to announce it to the world that they are declaring their independence, and they actually want to explain why they're doing this. It's sort of a remarkable thing. When you think through history and the beginnings of nations, that doesn't happen. People don't stand up to the world. Most regimes throughout history were founded either in fraud or murder. So you don't stand up to the world and announce what you're doing, but the Americans do. And they select a committee of 5 people to go write a draft of a Declaration of Independence. And in that committee is both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And Adams goes to Jefferson. And this must have pained him to admit this. And Adams says, Tom, you need to write the Declaration for 2 reasons. Number 1, you're 10 times a better writer than I am. And number 2, I'm John Adams, and I'm kind of an asshole, and everybody hates me. And if I write it, no one's going to want to buy onto it. So Jefferson agrees, and he writes the first draft of the Declaration. And if you remember, in the middle part of the Declaration are all these grievances against the king. And most of them are very short. They're 1 line with 1 exception. The longest grievance against the king I've given to you on page 2 at the bottom. Here's what he writes. He, meaning King George III. King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. Right? Those Africans had never offended George III. Captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This piratical warfare, I love Jefferson, right? He's talking about the crown prince of England. He's nothing but a low pirate. He's just a thief on the sea. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. And those caps there, those capital letters, those are Jefferson's. Capital M, capital E, capital N. What are these Africans being bought and sold as if they're property? They're men. It's the same word he uses. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created. What are these Africans? Men. Does Tom Jefferson know that these Africans are human beings? Absolutely, there's no question at all. When you look at the founders on an individual basis, I'm going to take my watch off here so I can keep an eye on our time. You find a whole spectrum. On one extreme would be someone like Alexander Hamilton. I don't know if you know anything about the upbringing of Hamilton. Hamilton was born into the most miserable squalor and poverty, raised on this little island in the West Indies. He's He's a bastard son. He watches his mother die when he's a little kid. He's orphaned. He grows up with nothing. Hamilton is not the type of man who buys slaves. Only rich people buy slaves. Slaves are expensive. But he sees the trade. He sees slave ships coming in and out of the ports of his hometown, and he hates it. Hamilton, as a little boy, develops a burning hatred for slavery. And he leads the effort to found anti-slavery societies once he gets to the United States. I'm convinced had Hamilton lived longer, he would have been a great leader in the anti-slavery cause. You remember the fate of Hamilton, don't you?
Yeah.
If there is one, maybe the sleaziest human being in American politics. Now we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel, right? You take all the sleazeballs in the world of politics, and at the very bottom is a man named Aaron Burr. And when it came to, in the election of 1800, there was a tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and Burr. And Hamilton was worried Burr might win. And as much as Hamilton had come to hate Jefferson, these two were mortal enemies, Hamilton said, I hate everything Jefferson represents, but at least he's honest about his position. Aaron Burr is just a slime ball. You can't trust him. He's dishonest. And so Hamilton weighs in and helps secure the election for Jefferson as the third president. And that burns in Aaron Burr's soul. And Burr challenges him to a duel. And so they go and they meet on the dueling field. Dueling was very common, but typically, ladies, you know how we men are? You've seen us in bars, right? You see how we act? What happens when one guy bumps into the other guy? We got to bump back just a little bit, right? And that's what guys do. So often, if you were challenged in a duel, you would go and you would show up on the field and nothing would happen. The fact that you were courageous enough to come show up, it's like the two bullies who are going to fight after school. And they go out, they meet on the playground yard, and they end up talking and shaking hands and walking off. So they have a duel, and very often they would miss intentionally so that they could go get drunk together at the bar and talk and make friends. So Hamilton does. Hamilton pulls his pistol and shoots off into the air. And Aaron Burr draws his and blows a hole through Hamilton's chest. And we lose one of the greatest anti-slavery figures in history. Yeah, Burr was supposed to be his vice president. And there was separate balloting for president and vice president. And so they end up with a tie. And that then ends up being thrown into the House of Representatives, who settles it, which is, yes. And so basically they didn't control the voting, and Burr got as many votes as the main ticket as Thomas Jefferson. That's right. Yes, exactly. So you have people like Hamilton who never have any involvement in the institution of slavery, except for hating it and trying to get rid of it. In the middle, I would put someone like George Washington. Washington grows up with slavery. He grows up on a plantation where there's slaves. He inherits slaves. And yet, in the course of his adult life, he comes to understand that it's wrong. And he leads the charge against it, and eventually manumits, frees all of his own slaves. At the other extreme, I would put someone like Jefferson. Jefferson, too, grows up in a slave society, grows up on a slave plantation, inherits slaves from his own family, inherits more slaves when he marries from his wife's estate, and never frees his slaves. Now, it gets a little complicated with Jefferson. In every one of the original states, remember, under British law, before the Revolution, when they were 13 British colonies in North America, slavery was legal throughout the British Empire. Therefore, slavery was legal throughout all 13 colonies. As those colonies became states in the course of the Revolution, state by state they started adopting manumission laws. Laws of manumission were the legal process by which a slave owner could free a slave. And generally it was quite expensive. Here was the basic idea. Imagine if a slave owner walked up to a slave, and this slave is ignorant, he can't read, he can't write, he has no money. And the slave owner says, "You're free, go. Go away, get off my property. You're a free man right now, leave." What is that slave going to do? How's he going to feed himself? He's probably going to turn to crime that night. So manumission laws said there's a process to free a slave legally. Typically, a slave had to have a certain amount of money or property. Some states had literacy requirements. They had to be able to read and write a basic contract or sign their name so that they could be productive members of society. The point is, it was very expensive to manumit slaves. Jefferson had almost 200 of them, and Jefferson, as brilliant as he was, one thing he was really bad at, personal finances. Some of you investors in the room, Jefferson could have used your help. And he literally didn't have the money to manumit his slaves. He died broke, owing a lot of people a lot of money. Now, I don't let Jefferson off the hook that easily. If you read about his estate at Monticello, what we learn about Jefferson, first of all, he loved books. And books at that day were rare and expensive. Does anyone recall when the British burned down the Library of Congress in the War of 1812? Do you know how they replaced their books? You know where they went?
Jefferson gave him his library.
Yeah, Jefferson, exactly. They went to Jefferson. He had the most massive collection of books in the country. And then as soon as he gave his books to the Library of Congress, he starts reassembling his own personal library. I think he did sell it. He actually sold it. He was a smart enough businessman to sell it. Well, that's before there was a tax deductible loophole there, you know.
He wasn't worried about it.
That's right. We also know that he loved wine. He really loved imported French champagne. So the question is, could Jefferson have spent less money on booze and books and more money manumitting his slaves? He could have. I wish he would have. He would have been a better man had he done that. But when somebody wants to attack Jefferson, I like to remind them, Jefferson is the poet of liberty. Jefferson figured out how to articulate the principles of freedom in a way that to this day resonate around the world. Jefferson said all men are created equal. Should we get rid of that too, if you don't like Jefferson? When critics, scholars, academics, pundits criticize Jefferson as a hypocrite, my response is thank God for hypocrisy. I'm glad he was a hypocrite, because what would you have preferred? That he be a consistent, principled racist? If those are the options, I would rather he be a hypocrite, that he hold up a standard even if he doesn't live up to it perfectly himself. Does anyone recall, just as an example of the influence of Jefferson in the Declaration? You remember in 1989 those students out in a public forum called Tiananmen Square in China? Do you remember the response of the Chinese government, the communists? Well, they did two things. First, they escorted out all Western media, so that to this day, we don't exactly know what happened at Tiananmen Square. And then the tanks rolled in. These were college students. These were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids standing out. And the tanks rolled in. And they were those tanks, I don't know much about military tactics, but I know this. Those tanks have this really convenient little mechanism where there's this little metal flappy window that allows the guy inside to stick the barrel of his machine gun out and mow down students while he's pretty safe inside, which is exactly what they did. When those tanks rolled in and chopped down those college students, do you know what they were doing? They were reading the Declaration